Hi, I'm Crystal Hurd, and welcome to my channel, That Lewis Lady. Today we're going to talk about the fact that Narnia is not an allegory, which means technically Aslan doesn't represent Jesus. Now you might be saying there's a lot of parallels here, Crystal. Some, yes. But let's define an allegory, and then we're going to talk about how Narnia doesn't qualify and why, and what Lewis's idea was overall. So what is an allegory? It's a word that we teach all the time here. I'm a 20 plus year public school teacher, and I talk about allegory. I teach allegory. And so where does it come from? It actually comes from the Greek allos and agoria, which means other speaking. So a more modern translation of that is an expression by means of symbolic fictional figures and actions of truths or generalizations about human existence. So in other words, it's typically a story where something that is real is represented by things that are not real. Now, a few years ago, I was having a conversation with someone, and I mentioned this very topic, which is one of the reasons why I'm making the video. I said, you know, Lewis said that Narnia wasn't an allegory. He said it very explicitly, multiple times. And the person I was speaking to said, well, maybe Lewis didn't really understand what allegory was. To which I replied, well, that's funny because he wrote a book about it. It's called The Allegory of Love, and it was one of C.S. Lewis's very first academic works. Academic, okay, written in the 30s, and has still extolled for so many great things that it contains. Even here we are almost 100 years after its publication, and still many scholars say this is a wonderful, outstanding piece of academic writing. So Chapter 2 in The Allegory of Love, I have a couple different copies, but I love these old copies so much, is actually a chapter dedicated to allegory, and I'll read a little bit for you. In our new inquiry, however, there is no question of finding and no possibility of imagining the ultimate origins. Allegory, in some sense, belongs not to medieval man, but to man, or even to mind in general. It is of the very nature of thought and language to represent what is immaterial in picturable terms. What is good or happy has always been high, like the heavens, and bright like the sun. Evil and misery were deep and dark from the first. Pain is black in Homer, and goodness is a middle point for Alfred, no less than for Aristotle. To ask how these married pairs of sensibles and insensibles first came together would be great folly. The real question is how they ever came apart. And to answer that question is beyond the province of the mere historian. So Lewis goes on to talk explicitly sort of about how allegory worked in medieval tradition, which is a study in medieval tradition, and talks about why the writers of the past used allegory and used it very successfully. Now, most more modern writers don't really use it as much. And many people actually did ask Lewis, hey, are you sure that's not an allegory? Because honestly, it seems like it is based on what you're saying. So I wanted to pull out my handy dandy volume 3 of the collected letters. And what I'm going to read to you now is a letter to Mrs. Hook. This is dated 29 December 1958. And the page number is 1004 if you have a copy, whether a physical copy or an e-copy. By Dear Mrs. Hook, by an allegory, I mean a composition, whether pictorial or literary, in which immaterial realities are represented by feigned physical objects, e.g. a pictured Cupid, allegorically represents erotic love, which in reality is an experience, not an object, occupying a given area of space. Or in Bunyan, John Bunyan, a giant represents despair. If Aslan represented the immaterial deity in the same way in which giant despair represents despair, he would be an allegorical figure. In reality, however, he is an invention, giving an imaginary answer to the question, what might Christ become like if there really were a world like Narnia, and he chose to be incarnate and die and rise again in that world, as he actually has done in ours? This is not allegory at all, so in Paralandra, this also works out a supposition. Suppose even now In some other planet, there were a first couple undergoing the same that Adam and Eve underwent here, but successfully, and here he's referring to the Ransom trilogy. Allegory and such supposals differ because they mix the real and the unreal in different ways. Bunyan's picture of giant despair does not start from supposal at all. It is not a supposal, but a fact that despair can capture and imprison a human soul. What is unreal, fictional, is the giant, the castle, and the dungeon. The incarnation of Christ in another world is mere supposal, but granted the supposition he would really have been a physical object in that world as he was in Palestine, and his death on the stone table would have been a physical event no less than his death on Calvary. So, very good explanation of what allegory is and isn't, and explicitly talks about ASLAN not being an allegory, but a supposition. Here's this world I've created. Let's say that a lion showed up there. Let's say that he sang it into existence, like in The Magician's Nephew. What would happen? Let's see. Let's drop these characters into a storyline and let's see what they do. Now, a lot of people will say, okay, well, if it's not an allegory and it's a supposal, explain to me why and what Lewis's concept of allegory was and why Narnia doesn't qualify. So for one, C.S. Lewis talks about the importance of story. Now there are several different examples of an allegory. One is George Orwell's Animal Farm. Animal Farm was very, very popular. It was also released around the same time as 1984. And a lot of people don't know this, but C.S. Lewis actually reviewed 1984 and Animal Farm by George Orwell. If you have On Stories and other essays on literature, some of these essays are included, some of them aren't. So this particular one has some of the reviews. In it is C.S. Lewis's review of George Orwell. In it, he actually argues that Animal Farm is the superior text. That 1984, yeah, it's great. But Animal Farm does have the allegory, and we can make those parallels between the Russian Revolution and these characters on a farm. So he actually argues that he feels that Animal Farm is the stronger of the two works. Very interesting to see how he compares the two. But C.S. Lewis did write, and there are many great essays in this, but he writes On Stories, okay, that we sometimes focus on the wrong things. This is the very beginning of the essay. It is astonishing how little attention critics have paid to story, considered in itself. Granted, the story, the style in which it should be told, the order in which it should be disposed, and above all, the delineation of characters have been abundantly discussed. But the story itself, the series of imagined events, is nearly always passed over in silence, or else treated exclusively as affording opportunities for the delineation of character. There are indeed other notable exceptions, and he continues on with that. But I think this is interesting, and he makes a great point. Sometimes when we look at a piece of work, an artwork, and we start to sort of dissect it and look at it, we forget that it's a story for entertainment, for fun, right? Allegory, while it's a story, it's also supposed to teach you a lesson or expand on something. Now, I think specifically, and I'm thinking about Shakespeare, for example, Shakespeare grew up watching morality plays when he was a young man. Michael Wood and some other, Stephen Greenblatt, they talk about how Shakespeare was sort of turned on to theater. It's because very early in his life, there were traveling actors and traveling troops, and they would do morality plays. So they had characters named Guilt or whatever. And it was very interesting because that moral was plain on the nose and pretty much hard to miss. It was a lesson. You're supposed to teach you a lesson. But sometimes you don't want a lesson. Sometimes you just want a story. And story can do both. But, as Lewis says, story, not lesson, should be paramount. Kids are very perceptive, and they do know when they're being fed a sermon or a lecture, a lesson, versus a story. The best kind are the ones that sneak up on you. That you read the story, you enjoy the story, and then when you take another look at it, all of these layers start to reveal themselves to you. What a great experience. And many of us have had that experience reading Lewis and Tolkien and some of the great writers. So Orwell, yes, was trying to have a story about animals, right, with Animal Farm, but ultimately he was trying to warn us against what these sort of caustic, terrible events were in the Russian Revolution and how we need to avoid those things in the future so we don't fall into the types of political situations. So at root, Orwell was trying to teach us something on top of giving us a story. Now that all sounds great. But like I said, who doesn't love story? Now, as somebody who has studied literature and creative writing over the years and have taught both, let me tell you, creativity is different for every single person. And creativity doesn't always work in patterns. Sometimes you have this great idea, you have this conflict and this character, and all these things start to come together. And you're wondering, yes, I could do this, I can do this, I can do this. All of these things are going to work together, right? And it's going to be a great story. Now, here's the issue with an allegory. An allegory is a one-to-one comparison, okay? It is, okay, I'm doing the Russian Revolution, so I have to have a Stalin character, and I have to have a Trotsky character, and I have to have a revolution where everybody rises up and gets angry, etc., etc., etc. What happens creatively is that you are restricted by the limits of the allegory, right? So while we have Aslan, and yes, he's a great leader, and yes, he sacrifices himself on the stone table, and yes, he is resurrected and helps win the battle. All of that is true, but we don't have other things like the Last Supper or the Via Dolorosa or some of the other things. While people could argue, this character might be Mary or this character might be Judas, which honestly is Edmund. But if we think about these things, Lewis did not stick strictly to the Jesus story when he was writing Aslan. Aslan is a supposal. He is not a one-to-one comparison. So when you're a writer and you're writing these stories, if you are writing allegory, you are strapped by the restrictions of the other thing that you are referencing. If you don't have that, then you have free range to do what you want, characters you can create, conflicts you can create, and you don't have to worry about all that other stuff having to be present in the story. Does that make sense? It really is sort of liberating for you to just write the story. Yeah, sure, you can have some supposals and some things that might reference other stories. But at the end of the day, it's still your story. And it's not a photocopy or, a reference to something else. We're not alluding to something else. It's an original story in that way. And that is what Lewis was trying to achieve. This is why he tells us over and over again that it is not an allegory, because he doesn't have the one-to-one comparison that you would need to qualify as an allegory. So the collected letters are a great way to see what Lewis was thinking in the day-to-day and responding to different people's questions and inquiries, especially on how to write story, what his intentions were with certain stories. So to finish out today, I wanted to read a bit that sort of encapsulates everything we've talked about. And this is from the excellent essay, Sometimes Fairy Stories May Say Best What's to Be Said. Let me now apply this to my own fairy tales. Some people seem to think that I began by asking myself how I could say something about Christianity to children, then fixed on the fairy tale as an instrument, then collected information about child psychology and decided what age group I'd write for, then drew up a list of basic Christian truths and hammered out allegories to embody them. This is all pure moonshine. I couldn't write in that way at all. Everything began with images: a fawn carrying an umbrella, a queen on a sledge, a magnificent lion. At first, there wasn't even anything Christian about them. That element pushed itself in of its own accord. It was part of the bubbling. Then came the form. As these images sorted themselves into events, became a story. They seemed to demand no love interest or no close psychology, but the form which excludes these things is the fairy tale. And the moment I thought of that, I fell in love with the form itself. Its brevity, its severe restraints on description, its flexible traditionalism, its inflexible hostility to all analysis, digression, reflections, and gas. I was now enamored of it. Its very limitations of vocabulary became an attraction. As the hardness of the stone pleases the sculptor, or the difficulty of the sonnet delights the sonneteer. On that side, as author, I wrote fairy tales because the fairy tale seemed the ideal form for the stuff I had to say. Then, of course, the man in me began to have his turn. I thought, I saw how stories of this kind could steal past a certain inhibition, which had paralyzed much of my own religion and childhood. Why did one find it so hard to feel as one was told one ought to feel about God or about the sufferings of Christ? I thought the chief reason was that one was told one ought to. An obligation to feel can freeze feelings, and reverence itself did harm. The whole subject was associated with lowered voices, almost as if it were something medical. But supposing that by casting all these things into an imaginary world, stripping them of their stained glass and Sunday school associations, one could make them, for the first time, appear in their real potency. Could one not thus steal past those watchful dragons? I thought one could. And there you have it. Lewis was enamored by the worlds he created, and he wanted the children to also enjoy the story he created. No inhibitions, no restrictions. And that's why he chose not to make Narnia an allegory. So what do you think? Tell me what you're thinking down in the comments below, and let's chat. Have a great day.